Hello and welcome to Tech Deals Part 4 of the $4,000 Ultimate System Build 2017 edition Skylake-X. Build video time. In this video, we're going to see a detailed step-by-step assembly process to put everything into this machine, how to install the liquid cooler, how to put the CPU on the motherboard, and everything including cable management. Now, if you look at the length down below on the video, please keep in mind this is a step-by-step guide designed to be followed along if you're building your own system. Now, if you already know how to put together a computer, you may be more interested in the other videos in this series. Linked in the video description below will be the full playlist for this video series, including parts overview, the why vlog, why did we choose these parts, and then coming up after this will be various performance videos, game and otherwise. Now, I would like to emphasize that this is just a guide. You may be putting together an AMD Threadripper build, or you may be putting together a slightly different system. The reality is you can use this video to give you a general guide as to how to put together your system. You'll have to make minor modifications if you're not using this case. For example, the cooler mounting locations, the fans will be slightly different, but hopefully this gives you some ideas, hints, and some ways of thinking of putting together your system. I cover airflow direction, for example, push-pull on the fans, that kind of thing. All of that will be discussed here in the video. Also linked down in the video description below will be links to Amazon and Newegg for all the parts in this build. When you're going shopping for your own system build, check those out and compare prices and buy it where it makes the most sense for you. You will also find links to Twitter, Twitch, and Patreon down there as well. Please consider following me over there as well if you are interested. And without further ado, let's get straight to the system build. Here we are with the parts laid out on the table. You can see I have the case laying here, motherboard, CPU, power supply, the video card and hard drive are over off to the side. But the important thing is when building a machine that you lay yourself out a work area in order to put everything together. I am now going to take the case off the table simply to show you the setup of the motherboard, which you could certainly do in another place, but I'll just do it right here. Here you can see the motherboard laid out on the table. The first thing we want to do is go ahead and install the CPU. Now this can be done once the system is actually put together and the motherboard is installed, but it's easier to see what you're doing when the motherboard is out of the case. Please note that I have a cloth down to protect the table. There are things protruding from the bottom of the motherboard, so if you set it down on a hard surface, you do risk scratching it, damaging it. So do be sure to put something soft down, such as a cloth like I have here, to protect the board. When you're ready to install the CPU, be aware that these have to go in a specific order. Push this down gently and it will pop out just like so. And once that lifts up a bit, there will then be enough room to move the bottom one over. Be sure to leave this protective cover on until after you've installed the CPU. The pins are not on the processor, the pins are on the motherboard. If they get bent, your motherboard has to be replaced. When you lift this lever up, it's actually going to lift the cover here, which you can then lift all the way up. You will then see all of the CPU pins in place. Do not touch those. If you bend one of those, basically your motherboard stops working. There is only one direction the CPU can be installed in. Please note that there are notches on the top and the bottom of the CPU, but the CPU is directional. You can see there's a golden triangle in one corner. Match that up with the board. The CPU sets down and rests gently in place. It doesn't push down, it doesn't slide in, it simply sits right onto the socket. And in this case, it actually looks like it's upside down with the label facing that way. That's normal. That is because one corner has a different pin layout than the other corners. So examine the pattern of the pads as well as the pattern of the pins to make sure you have it in the correct orientation. Once the CPU is safely in place, then you can remove the plastic processor cover. Save this. Put it wherever your CPU was or in your motherboard box. If you ever need to send this in for warranty repair, they want to see that on there so there's no damaged pins. At this point, we're simply going to lower the cover into place. Be aware that you have to move this lever down first and lock it into place before you can put this lever down. Once that lever's in place, then this one can be brought down and it is now locked into place. The CPU is held into place on the top and bottom, which is different than it works on the consumer level platforms, which generally hold on the side. So it is a very different socket to the 1156 or 1155 or 1151 if you're familiar with the current consumer level platforms. The next thing we need to do is install our two M.2 SSDs, and so we're going to remove the two screws here from the heat shields. And then we're going to lift the heat shield up. If you look underneath the heat shield, you will see 1 and then 2 M.2 slots. This is the shorter length one, and this is a longer one for extended devices. Almost nothing actually uses the full length, but at least it does have one if you need it. I have removed the post that is in the first slot here, which we simply don't need because we're going to use the full length. And I've removed the screw from here. We're going to use the screw and the mount here to put a solid state drive, and we'll still use this post here to actually connect it. Here you can see the 2 NVMe solid state drives that we're going to be installing. The 960 Pro is going to be our boot drive installed into the top slot, and it slides into place just like so at a 30-degree angle. And then the 960 Evo will go into the bottom slot, again installed at a 30-degree angle. These do not require a lot of pressure. You simply slide them into place, and then you simply take the screws and you simply push them down and screw them into place. Be aware that very nice motherboards like this have heat shields, and you have to remove the protective sticker from the thermal pads. That's what these blue things are right here, so we'll remove that. Because this SSD is going to be using the same screw and post that holds this down, we'll simply take our screw and we will lower this into place and basically screw the entire mount together. Then we'll screw the bottom screw on. Our M.2 heat shield is back in place. We did remember to take the paper off. We did put the screw here to hold this one in place, and this screw is doing double duty, holding both the SSD and the cover in place. Now when we install a graphics card on top, this will protect the SSD from heat from the graphics card. At this point, we're not going to do anything else to our motherboard. Our CPU is installed, our M.2s are installed. The RAM will not get installed until it's in the system. There'll be too many things plugged in and going around it. They would just be in the way, so we'll put those in at the end. Here you can see the computer case back on the table. There's several things we're going to put in here before we put the motherboard in. First things first, we need to put the I/O shield in. The I/O shield is what is going to protect the back plate where all the exterior ports are. Every motherboard comes with its own. To install it, you simply pop it into place. The square, there's simply retention tabs around each end. You simply line it up and you simply push it into place. I have turned the computer case on the back so you can see what I am doing. This actually gives you a good chance to see what happens when you upgrade your motherboard. You can see here I have a Fatality, which is an ASRock brand, I/O shield already in place. This case used to hold my Ryzen 7 1700X test system. There was never a build of this system, but I had several motherboards in here, the most recent being the gaming K4 Fatality motherboard from ASRock, which is what the Ryzen 7 was installed in. I took it apart. That's going to end up in something else because I'm using this case from a new Skylake-X build. To remove this, all we do is we push on the corners and it simply pops right out just like so. It really is that easy. We take our new I/O shield and we simply line it up, and you simply push the corners in, and there it is. It snaps into place. Just like that. If you have a good case, and this is a good case, this is the Corsair Obsidian 750D, snapping these in and out is easy as pie. If you have a much cheaper case, a budget no-name case, sometimes these can be quite difficult, but in these quality cases, that is very easy. The next thing that we're going to do is install our Corsair RM1000X power supply. Why? Because it's big and heavy, and I want to put that in the case before I start messing with the motherboard. No chance of dropping this on a motherboard. Installing this is as simple as lining up the screws with the back of the case. There is actually a guide right here. Now, every case is going to be a little bit different in how these install, but we're simply going to set it in place with the fan down. This case does have an air intake in the bottom that is an air filter, and it simply slides right back into place. We then take our screwdriver, standard number 2 Phillips head screwdriver, and we simply screw it into place. And there we go, the power supply is in place. Now, people have asked me in the past, what about mounting them upside down with the fan facing up rather than facing down? The reality is it almost doesn't matter. With a 1000 watt power supply, the fan does not even turn until more than 400 watts of power are being drawn, and it doesn't turn above idle until 700 watts. It's hardly ever going to be used. The next thing I'm going to install to simply get it off my desk is I'm going to put one of the hard drives in place. I'm going to take the middle bay here just because, and I'm going to take the 8 terabyte Seagate hard drive, and I'm going to install it by simply pushing it into these pins. This is a toolless tray here. It simply snaps into place just like so. The power and data connector are facing down, and then we simply slide it directly into the tray. Now the actual power and data connectors will have to be plugged in on the other side later, but it gets me something off the desk and puts it into the machine. One of the things I like about this case is it's expandable. You can't see it very well in the video, but it is right here. You can mount additional 3-drive bays here, here, and here. There's actually rails underneath, and there's rails on top of the bay. You can actually add a ridiculous number of hard drive bays to this case if you want. 3 more here, 3 more here. If your motherboard allows for it, 3 more, and then even more here. There is a larger version of this case called the Corsair Obsidian 900D, which truly allows our gargantuan number of hard drives. Now it is time to install our motherboard. Now I'm taking the cables and simply getting them as much out of the way as I possibly can because we want to focus on the motherboard mounting tray. Now most likely the 2 kinds of motherboards you're likely to put in a build like this are either an ATX or an eATX. There are ITX and micro ATX boards, but I don't think most people building a system with a 1,000-watt power supply and a full tower case are going to be doing that, but you certainly could. Make note that most good cases will mark on the motherboard tray which actual mounts are used for each kind. Now the M's here are for micro ATX and the A's are for ATX. If you look down on the bottom, these are only going to be used for full-size ATX boards, which is what we have, so we're going to use all of them. One thing I love about the Corsair cases is they put a post here in the middle rather than a mounting screw. It gives something for the motherboard to hold on to. So we're going to need screws around the border, but there's a post in the middle for that place. One thing I would like to call your attention to, and it's very important to check this, you need to look around and see if there are extra posts that you're not going to use. This case has an extra post right here, which I have actually used in other boards. The Ryzen board had a screw hole here. This particular motherboard does not have an extra screw hole. It has one at the top, it has one at the bottom, and it has one in the middle for this post right here, but it does not use this one. Now, if you leave this mounting post here, it's going to push on the back of the motherboard. You'll damage the board. You might cause a short. So this is a very important part to actually make sure that you do have a mounting post in every place that your board wants one and don't in every place that it doesn't. This, by the way, is where needle nose pliers come in really handy because that post did not want to come loose. It was very tight, but just a little bit of a turn to the left got it loosed, and then my fingers could take it right off. When you install a motherboard, keep in mind that it does not go straight down. You have the I/O ports to consider, and we do have a 140mm fan here. Now, I could remove this, but it shouldn't be necessary. I've taken boards in and out otherwise, but keep in mind that it goes down at a bit of an angle and then comes in. This post right here, this hole right here, is going to mount on this post, and it will keep the board from sliding around in the case. Well, it just goes to show that you learn something every day. As nice as it is to have this shroud that looks all fancy, this is actually bumping into the edge of this fan. The clearance isn't quite enough, so I am going to pull the fan out. It is possible there won't be enough clearance for it. It is possible I'll take the shroud off. We'll see when I get it put together. And now that the fan is out of the way, now we should have no issues whatsoever with installing this. Yep, that goes in much better. With the motherboard in place, this one peg here is posting through that hole, and what it means is the motherboard is not sliding around. Now we take our magnetic screwdriver. We are now going to screw the rest of these in. Please keep in mind, don't screw them in all the way until you have every one in and the board is lined up. I now have all the screws in place and I have tightened them down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You may have a 9th here if your case doesn't have a post, and you may have a 10th here depending upon the design of your board. I mentioned earlier that this shroud was in the way with the fan. Now, having measured it, this will reinstall, so there is enough clearance for this, but keep in mind that if I put a fan here, the beautiful logo and the shroud are completely blocked. Whether or not you want the extra cooling or whether or not you want the pretty gaming M7 logo is entirely a personal preference. I am going to install this because cooling is critical, and I am going to install it in a blow air in configuration. So I'm actually going to suck air from the back of the computer in to this point. The fans in the front will blow air in, and the 280mm radiator will be on the top of the case, expelling air out the top. The idea is to create as much airflow into the case and out the top as possible. If you install this in a expel air out the back, what you end up with is multiple fans on the top and a fan on the back blowing air out of the case, and only 2 fans in the air in the front sucking air in. This creates negative pressure in the case. Now, negative pressure does improve the dust situation, but it reduces cooling a bit. By reversing this fan and having it blow air in, we create positive pressure. 3 fans in, 1 fan out, with a little bit more room over here for free air exhaust, because there's actually room to mount another fan up here, which I'm not going to do. This will increase the dust a bit inside the case, but it will make for a cooler running system. And here you can see the fan successfully reinstalled, turned around the other way to blow air in. There is another benefit with a high-powered system such as this to have this set as an air intake. With the radiator up here blowing the hot air out of the system, this brings in fresh, cool air directly over the CPU and the memory modules. The voltage regulators are up here as well, and those get very hot, so this creates additional airflow with fresh outside air. The next thing that I want to do is run power to the motherboard. We have 2 CPU power connectors at the top, and we have with a 24-pin ATX connector here, which will run from our power supply. The reason we do these first is because they are the biggest, thickest cables and the hardest to cable manage behind the motherboard. The things like the motherboard connectors and the drive connectors are smaller and easier to manage, so do your big cables first and then your smallest last. First up, we have our 24-pin ATX connector. This side goes on the CPU, this side goes on the motherboard. I am going to connect it to here, and we're going to run it through this hole, up the back, and then through here and plug it in. So I have that plugged in now, and it's not snaked back there yet, but we'll turn this over and do it in a minute. Now we need 2 the 8-pin CPU power connectors. Now, these are actually 4 plus 4. We'll split one, but we need 2 of them because there are 2 connectors. We'll run them both here and then behind and up around. These have the furthest to go, so they're the trickiest to manage in a large case. Here you can see the 2 CPU power connectors plugged in. I'm going to run those through here, and we'll turn this case over now. I now have the case turned over. You can see the back of the motherboard here, and you can see the various cable management options. Yes, it's true that you can try to plug everything in at once and then try to manage everything at once. But unless you do this all the time, it becomes a management nightmare. My suggestion, if you don't build a lot of computers, do these 1 or 2 cables at a time. Yes, you'll have to flip the computer over a few times, but there are fewer chances of mistakes. It is worth noting at this point that zip ties are your friend. Now, I have mentioned this in previous build videos, but for $5 on Amazon, you can buy hundreds of zip ties that will last you essentially forever unless you build a system every week. Now, this Corsair power supply does come with these smaller zip ties, but sometimes you want larger ones, and so I will link down in the video description below to several hundred of these you can buy for $5. If you take a look at my cables, you'll see I have zip tied them here and I have zip tied them here. Please note that this is not super tight. In fact, these are ever so slightly loose. We are not attempting to secure Fort Knox here. We are simply trying to keep the cables from flopping around on the back of the system and from touching the back of the motherboard. These are the RAM slots. This is the CPU. This actually gets very hot. You don't want any loose cables touching this. So we are simply holding it in place on this end and that end. They're plugged into something, so they're fine. Clippers are very handy. Definitely be sure to cut off the excess that you don't need from both ends. We will plug these back in to that side when we get it around. Now we're going to take our power cable here, and now we need to find a routing solution. The back of the case, you'll see, has these indentations here, these loops, to tie things off. Now we're going to put this cable through here on that spot, and you'll actually find it's fairly snug. I'm going to tie it off at both of these points. It keeps it away from here, allowing me to do better cable management, and it makes sure that it doesn't touch the motherboard and these hot RAM slots. I now have these tied off. Again, it is not Fort Knox here. I mean, there is still some give. The whole point is to keep it from flopping around the case, not to secure it against atomic attack. And we just trim off the extra using our clippers. At this point, we're going to flip the case back over and plug them in. For our CPU power connectors here, one of them is an 8-pin and one is a 4-pin. These simply slide apart, so I'll slide them apart here. Because of where it is in the case, you can't see it very well, so I'll just show you what it looks like when it's finished. And here you go, they are both plugged in. Please note that if you have to split it for a 4-pin CPU connector, both sides are not the same. They are keyed. One side has squares on it, the other side is all the odd shapes. So be sure you're installing the correct half of the +4. Now we are going to install the 24-pin ATX connector. Please note, there's nothing reinforcing behind here. You have a mount here and a mount here. If you simply try to shove this in and push down, you run a very real risk of simply cracking your motherboard, and that would be bad. So my suggestion, place your fingers underneath the board and provide backplate reinforcing with your fingers on the edge here while you are pushing down. Work it in end to end slowly. Don't just try to shove the whole thing in at once. This is a lot of pins to push in. There's a lot of resistance. Some will go in easier than others. Hopefully for you it goes in easy. But take your time, rock it back and forth. You don't want to crack your motherboard. Well, I have to say that I am very pleased that went in easier than most. Quality power supply, quality motherboard helps. The connectors are made very well. There is a tab here. You've got to make sure you push it down far enough that it actually clicks and locks into place. Otherwise, over time, this is going to work its way out and it'll just pop off in the middle of using your machine, and that would be bad. Now, I am aware that this is sticking up a bit. There's really nothing you can do about it. There's so many cables coming up here that unless you have a specialty designed L-shaped or flat cable, which those do exist in custom form, that's pretty much as good as it's going to get. It is now time to connect our front panel connectors. Now, your front panel connectors will vary from machine to machine. Are you going to have USB 2, USB 3, front panel audio? You've got your power switch, your reset switch, etc. Now, there are various connector places down here for all of these loose connectors, power switches, etc. There's no way for me to actually film it, and it varies from board to board anyway. So what you're going to need to do is you will need to take your motherboard manual and you'll need to turn to the page that details where all those connectors go, because it also is different from board to board. As far as USB 3 front panel headers, that's what that connector plug looks like. And then USB 2 connector headers look like this. In fact, it says USB right there if you can see it on camera. The front audio panel connector looks very similar, but the blocking hole is in a different spot, and that goes over here, whereas the USB connectors go here. They're both 10-pin connectors, but which one is missing a pin, it's in a different location for each one, so be sure to double check that. And there we go. What you saw cut out of there was about 20 minutes of adjusting, readjusting, finagling, moving stuff around and playing with it. Every time I build a machine, I remain more and more convinced that we are way overdue for an adjustment to the ATX standard. The front cable situation is honestly a mess, but that's not the fault of this case or this board. That's the ATX spec, which needs an update. In any case, moving on from that, we have our USB 3.0 connector plugged in here. I've got this cable. I'll flip this over in a minute and show you what it looks like, but I've got it routed up here and tied off in the back. This is our USB 2.0 cable for the front panel connectors. This case has two USB 2 and two USB 3. Next to it, these are the front panel headers run through this cable management grommet right here. That's our power switch, reset switch, hard drive activity light, etc. Then we have two case fans plugged in right here. That's the two intake fans plugged into the bottom of the board. There's actually room for another one here. And then we have our front panel audio connectors right here. If you have ever used your front panel audio connectors, in most cases, they don't sound that great because these are cheap cables in most cases and they are not shielded. I wouldn't use them unless you're using low quality speakers or headphones. It is worth noting that you can see a cable right here. I didn't have a lot of options short of having it run straight across here. Unfortunately, these fan cables are not very long and it has to run all the way over here. A larger case or shorter fan cables would make it impossible. In truth, with this many fans, a fan extension cable would not be uncalled for and would actually make cable management much easier. The one last thing I want to mention before I turn it over is take a look right here. This is actually this fan. I looked at ways of running it over here and it just gets in the way, and we're going to mount a radiator here. This is actually a system fan header. This is the pump header, and the CPU fan header is unfortunately way here in the corner, which is like the last place I would ever put it. Swapping those would make sense. Now, you could certainly plug this case fan into the CPU header, but I wouldn't recommend it. For various power management and controlling of the fans on the cooler, I would plug that into the one labeled CPU header because that's what the motherboard is expecting. Here you can see the back side of the case. Now, I've already talked about how these are cable managed and run off. You can see the main connector here. This is the USB 3 front panel connector, which I've simply looped around and zip tied to this power cable. This is the power cable for the rear case fan, which I've tied off here. It doesn't quite reach, but that's okay. I'll loop this around. And the reason is I'm keeping it off of the motherboard. If you don't do this and you run it back here, you run the risk of this falling down. These are the voltage regulators.
that will melt this cable. If this just sits here and rests on that, you're going to end up with a short, or at the worst case scenario, a fire. So make sure that that doesn't happen. That's why that's zip tied off. Here you can see a small zip tie where that is the front case fan that I've just tied here to keep it from moving around, that's plugged into the motherboard, and then the other case fan is right there. Now there was a zip tie here which I actually cut. It was holding these. These are all of the front panel headers, and in order to get them here, these are the small ones: reset switch, power switch, LED, etc. They weren't long enough, they didn't reach. Now, they could be run through this hole and they would reach better, but then they run across the board and get in the way, and I really wanted to run them there. So I cut this tie, but this tie is still here, and so they're secure. Cable management takes a little bit of time, but really it didn't take me that long. I probably spent 20 minutes playing around with it. Give me another 20 minutes and I'd probably make it look nicer. Don't neglect this. If you're building a multi-$1,000 machine, there is no excuse not to do decent cable management. Side note, for those of you who remember my $4,000 Ultimate System Build 2016 edition, yeah, the cable management wasn't great in that machine, and several people commented on it, and I absolutely agree and acknowledge that. That system's been changed several times since then anyway, and it has been improved, but we're doing it better this time. Next up, let's do the hardest thing left to install: RAM, graphics card storage. That's all pretty straightforward. Let's do the cooler. Now the cooler actually comes in two steps. First, you have to consider where you're going to mount it, and do you want the fans in a push or pull configuration. As I already discussed with this fan here, I'm bringing air in, and these are going to exhaust the hot air out. Now this is going to cause the CPU to run a bit hotter. On an intake configuration, we'd bring cool air into the machine, blowing it through the radiator, cooling our CPU down a bit. Now the reality is the Skylake-X is a hot running CPU. There is absolutely an argument for using an intake configuration. However, where the radiator is, if we did an air intake and we left this as an exhaust, we would have 4 intake fans and only 1 exhaust fan. Yeah, you can kind of sort of turn the front fans around, not really. Yes, you have some air coming out the front up here, but it really isn't the same thing. The way this case is designed, it really wants to see an exhaust out the top because this entire top is open. In fact, there's room for 3 140mm fans on the top. Now, one nice thing about the Skylake-X platform rather than the consumer platform is the mounting holes. These come pre-built into the motherboard. It's actually very simple to mount because this simply bolts into these 4 holes. It's fairly straightforward to mount to the motherboard. But we're putting this on first because once that's in place, it's very easy to install the RAM. What you don't want to do is try to install your big cooler when you've already got RAM modules in place. Now, it is worth pointing out that the actual mounting of your radiator is going to be completely case dependent. At the moment, I'm having to move rubber mounting grommets for the top of the case because this previously had a 240mm liquid cooler in it with the Ryzen 7 processor that I had in here. So I'm having to move the mounting spots from the 240mm section to the 280mm section. For anyone wondering why I don't show this in more detail, unless you buy this exact case and that exact cooler, the procedure is going to be different. You're going to have to read the instruction manual. You're going to have to look at how it mounts, how the screws go in, and your case as to where it gets mounted because it is in fact individualized for every installation. The first screws here are by far the hardest to get into place. A helper is very handy on these 280mm installs. It's so large. My wife would be helping me, but unfortunately she is out with the kids at the moment. Patience. Above all else, patience is required. What I usually tend to do with these is just try to get the top row mounted in first and try to line the screw holes up and just get them started. None of these have been tightened. Now we are halfway there. One of the questions that's bound to be asked is push or pull. Why do I have the fans mounted on the top of the case? Why not mount them here? Actually, it would be easier to put them on the bottom. Here's why I don't. If you put the fans on the bottom, blowing through the radiator out the top of the case, dust will accumulate between the fans and the radiator, and the only way to really remove that dust is to remove the fans and blow off the radiator. By putting the fans on the top sucking air through, dust will tend to accumulate on the bottom of the radiator, which can be blown off with compressed air. It's easier to keep clean. Eventually, after 3 to 5 years, you'll probably need to take it apart and blow the dust out manually. However, Linus actually did a really good video a couple of years ago on his channel, Linus Tech Tips, where he showed the difference between two water cooler installations that had both been installed for a number of years. The one in the pull configuration had far less dust in it than the push. Various tests have been done by other channels over the years. I'm not going to bother to replicate them. Kyle over at Bitwit did a good test. There have been others. Is there better cooling? Is the cooling performance better with push or pull? And the reality is the difference is virtually nothing. So I configure my fans in this configuration for easier cleaning because I can blow off the bottom of the radiator more than anything else, although it is harder to install. Just as a side note, for anybody who disagrees with me on the mounting of the cooler, this is an example. It is your computer and your money. You don't like it? Build it your own way. I'm just explaining the reasoning behind my choice, but certainly other people will have a different way of doing it. It's not right or wrong, it's different. Build it however you want, but I prefer to have easier dust removal than anything else. Once this is installed, then you're going to install the screws into the mounting holes on the motherboard. Since this is a Skylake-X, we're going to use the ones that are uneven with the smaller screw on one side. There are even posts for installing onto the consumer level system. These are just finger tight. There's no need to use tools or anything to put these in, just turn them until they're tight. Okay, a couple of points here to point out. First of all, the mounting head here is square, and we're going to use the Intel bracket, which slides on just like so. It doesn't screw on or anything, it just rests. There we go. These 4 holes, which of course are differently sized for the different size Intel sockets, will fit over these 4 posts. Be aware, I still have the plastic cover on the thermal paste on the bottom. These coolers come pre-installed with thermal paste. You don't have to add more or change it. Once you apply it and then remove it, then you have to clean off the pump head, then you have to clean off the CPU and apply new thermal paste, which they don't come with. So if you ever have to remove one of these coolers and reinstall it, make sure that you have thermal paste to do it. Orientation is something to think about as well. Now here you can see the Corsair logo is face up. There's actually no rule about which way it has to orient, simply because it is in fact square. Although if you want the Corsair to be straight up, then you have to put it this way. Please note that if you want to use the Corsair link, that is over here on this side, and that means you're going to have a cable running out of this side down to your USB port, which frankly I think is a terrible spot. I wish they were over here, but hey, I didn't design it. We are now going to remove the plastic cover. You can see that that is now exposed. This is where we have to be careful. Just hold these cables back. There we go, push that down into place. When we push this down, we don't want to lift it back up again. Make sure our hoses are untangled. And I'm happy with them there. And that is now in place. I'm pushing down with my hand, not too hard, but reasonably hard. Then we take these thumb screws and we screw them on finger tight to start, making sure that the cooler does not come up off the CPU. We don't want to introduce air bubbles, if we can avoid it, between the CPU and the cooler plate. You actually may not even need to use tools. That is incredibly rock hard just using finger pressure. Now there is a Phillips head screw in the top of each of these. Don't over tighten this, you're just going to bend things. And that is absolutely not going anywhere. Be aware on these larger coolers, there are 2 connectors here that come off of the pump head, which will connect to your 2 fans. You don't have to plug the fans into your motherboard. This is what you plug into your motherboard. That just lets the motherboard know that something is plugged in. And then finally we have a SATA power connector. That is required to provide power to the pump and to the fans. I have now turned the case over because I want you to see that I've got the SATA power connector right here. I will eventually run a power connector up here to it. And then we have the various connectors here for the fans, which I simply zip tied back here. Again, cable management to make sure they don't get into anything that's hot. Another cut here because this falls squarely in the much easier to do when you're not trying to film it category. This cable here is the Corsair link cable. There is just no way to run it on the front side without having it run into absolutely everything. Thankfully, it does fit through this grommet here and it is currently plugged into the motherboard. However, if you leave it sitting here, again, CPU, RAM, etc. So I need to tie it off over here in order to make sure it doesn't touch anything. As a side note, with this one right here, I have now used all the zip ties that came with the power supply and I have now started to dip into my own zip tie reserve. If you're building a complicated high-end system, you will probably need your own zip ties. Here I have attached a power cable to the SATA connector because we can't even turn the machine on without having power. You are not going to see me in this video install any SSDs here. The full rack of SSDs here is actually going to come out of my Broadwell E machine, the 2016 $4,000 Ultimate System build, but not before this machine is fully up and running and I am sure that this is stable and everything works. I will then move data off of those drives onto other drives before I move them over here. So they're not included in part of this build, however they will ultimately end up in this machine. Because this is temporary, I'm going to take this cable here and I am simply going to take a twist tie and I'm simply going to tie it off here to keep it from moving around too much because this is not permanent. Ultimately, I'll have to skip this cable because it won't bend enough. This will end up providing power here and I'll use a separate SATA cable for those drives there. But I simply don't want this flopping around, so I'm just going to use a twist tie for the moment and then I'll replace it with proper connectors once I move everything over. That's not in this video. I'm not going to do a video of that, but I'm just letting you know why I'm doing this and what will go here in the future. 2 more cables have now been added. This is a serial ATA data cable through here plugged into the motherboard and it's plugged into the 8 terabyte hard drive back here. This is an extra 4 connector SATA cable plugged into the power supply and it's plugged into the hard drive. Again, neither one of these are set up in a permanent configuration because it's going to change when I put more drives. This is enough to get the system set up, validated, running, Windows installed, programs installed, stress test, make sure everything is stable before I actually move data over and start using this on a daily basis. And this cable here is also plugged into the power supply now as well. We are now finished on this side of the case, at least for now, because I'll be adding more. So now it's time to put the cover back on. I just want to take a minute and turn the case straight up so that you can see where the fan configuration is in this wonderful Obsidian 750D. Now this is a 280 millimeter cooler. These other holes here are if you're installing a 240 millimeter, 36% larger surface area. There is room over here for an additional fan as well, although it's a very tight fit with the drive cage in the way. So while there is space over here, it's really designed for just one cooler here, although you could put a single 360 millimeter cooler as well using these, and these holes. Now it is worth noting this is not how the case sits exposed. Instead, we have a lovely magnetic filter here. So this still allows air through, but it makes it much more attractive, and that simply peels off as simple as that. Take it out, blow it out, etc. With the case turned over, this right here is the Corsair Link cable, which is running right here, and I have it up zip tied with the power cables up here, so it's not touching the regulator modules and it's not in the way of the RAM. It's not perfect, but considering where this comes out of the hub, it's about as good as it would get. My suggestion to Corsair, redesign it and place it over here. It would be much nicer. Just a few more things to go. It is now time to install our 64 gigabytes of Trident Z RGB system RAM in all 8 slots. Yes, that is pretty cool, isn't it? You do want to make sure that all of your tabs that you're going to be using are open. Now these slots don't push open on the bottom, but they do open on the top. And now it's time to install 8 memory modules. There is an important point to make that I think is worth noting. Memory modules are tested and designed to work as they are sold. These are 32 gigabyte kits, 4 DIMMs each. So I am using 2 separate kits. G.Skill sells a 64 gigabyte Trident Z RGB kit, same 8 DIMM configuration. It costs more money, at least at the time of filming this, to buy a single 64 kit than it does to buy 2 32s. There is no guarantee that these kits are going to work together at DDR4 3200. They should. I actually expect them to, and they might not. But I want you to be aware that if you are in fact buying all 8 DIMMs, if I were buying these right now today, I would spend the extra money to buy the 8 kit. The reason is they've been tested together. Now, why did I buy these separately? I bought them at different times. The first 32 gigs was installed in my Ryzen 7 1700 build that I did back in March. And I bought a second kit to put into here. So that's why they're 2 separate kits rather than a 64. Now, why not leave that memory in that system and just buy another 64 gigs of RAM? Well, I would love to, but unfortunately, I am not made of money. I did actually ask every memory company, would they please send me some RAM? Yeah, well, as much fun as it is to get all of this stuff to play with, nobody was willing to send me 64 gigs of RAM. Side note, clean up after yourself. Save these. If you ever need to send them back under warranty, you're going to want these to ship them in, and it's a nice box. These do have a lifetime warranty, and if you need to send these back for any reason, having this packaging material makes it much easier. Always clean up after yourself. I mentioned before that this case allows you to expand the drive bays. I have an extra one here. I have several of these actually, and I just wanted to show you how this simply slides on. There we go. It slides on a whole lot better the right way. So this allows you to add more drive bays. There is room to add one more here, and then there's the slot here as well. You can put one here, and theoretically you could put one here, but you'd really start running into the motherboard connectors. But actually, it's just barely enough room. If you need that many drives, frankly, you need a larger case, the 900D. But I wanted to show you what that looked like, taking that in and out. Now, the next thing we need to install is this card right here. Now, some of you may be wondering from the original videos here, how are we going to install 3 NVMe solid-state drives when there's only 2 M2 slots on the motherboard? Not to worry, this card to the rescue. These are only about $20 or so, and this is actually going to let us install both our Western Digital Black as well as our Crucial MX300 SATA SSD because it provides ports for both. We're going to install it here in this slot. I did take a look at the motherboard manual to see which slots that I should use with one graphics card installed. Here I have taken the card out of the packaging. You can see here this says for SATA M2 only and for PCI M2 only. This is a 4X card. The PCI Express M.2 drive will run through this, and there's actually a cable here that will plug into one of the ports on the board that provides the SATA, because that's just an interface. That gets power from the card, but it gets data to one of the SATA ports. Here you can see the 2 M.2 SSDs installed, the Western Digital Black NVMe PCI Express, and then the Crucial MX300. There's no physical appearance difference other than the way the notches work. As far as this, we're just going to plug a SATA cable into here, and then this simply installs into the slot just like so. Here you can see the card installed. We have it screwed into place, and I've got a cable coming out the end of it, routed through that grommet back here into one of the ports. Now I'll actually clean that up and make that a little bit nicer once I install the rest of the SSDs, but for now that is absolutely not going to be in the way. Last but absolutely not least is our graphics card, provided courtesy of MSI, the GTX 1080 Ti Duke factory overclock triple fan card. I have previously tested this. I've done videos on it. I've done game performance. This thing is silent and cool. That is a RGB light on here. It is a very, very nice card and very reasonably priced. One of the less expensive factory overclock 1080 Ti's. We simply take it, line it up with the slot, make sure that's pushed down, and then slide it right into place. We do need to screw it into place and then add ourselves some power cables. Here our card is now screwed in, and we have 2 8-pin PCI Express power cables plugged in. Yes, I am fully aware this is just sitting here. Again, remember, I'm going to be moving more SSDs over here. I'm going to end up changing this anyway. Once those cables are in place, which are all going to come out of here, I will adjust how I do the power. But for now, it's good enough to get the system up and running. That definitely will not be permanent. Everything is now complete. We have our motherboard, CPU, RAM, fan blowing inward, 2 fans blowing inward, exhaust for our 280mm liquid cooler. We have 3 NVMe SSDs installed, a SATA SSD, an 8TB hard drive, our power supply, our graphics card. Our system is now ready to turn on and install Windows.
The $4,000 Ultimate System Build 2017 edition is now complete. Coming up next is going to be overclocking videos, Windows performance comparisons. I'm going to compare this both to Ryzen 7 as well as the consumer i7 chips, as well as some game performance reviews as well. Those will all be linked in the playlist down in the video description below. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with that big huge red button directly below. That's how you get notified of upcoming videos on this and other builds that I do. You're going to want to leave your comments down in the comment section, and remember to use the links in the video description to Amazon and Newegg for all of your shopping needs, and be sure to follow me on Twitch and Twitter as well. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video.